All right, Book 2 of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender as the Night begins in this way. In the spring of 1917, when Dr. Richard Diver first arrived in Zurich, he was 26 years old. A fine age for a man, indeed the very acme of bachelorhood. Even in wartime days, it was a fine age for Dick, who was already too valuable, too much of a capital investment to be shot off in a gun. Years later, it seemed to him that even in his sanctuary, he did not escape lightly. But about that, he never fully made up his mind. In 1917, he laughed at the idea, saying, apologetically, that the war didn't touch him at all. Instructions from his local board were that he was to complete his studies in Zurich and take a degree, as he had planned. Switzerland was an island, washed on one side by the waves of thunder around Gorizia, and on another by the cataracts along the Somme and the Aisne. For once there seemed more intriguing strangers than sick ones in the cantons, but that had to be guessed at. The men who whispered in the little cafes of Bern and Geneva were as likely to be diamond salesmen or commercial travelers. However, no one had missed the long trains of blinded or one-legged men, or dying trunks, that crossed each other between the bright lakes of Constance and Neuchâtel. In the beer halls and shop windows were bright posters presenting the Swiss defending their frontiers in 1914. With inspiring ferocity, young men and old men glared down from the mountains at phantom French and Germans. The purpose was to assure the Swiss heart that it had shared the contagious glory of those days. As the massacre continued, the posters withered away, and no country was more surprised than its sister republic when the United States bungled its way into the war. So, that's a great... The second passage doesn't have a whole lot to do with what I want to go through today or go through in this section, but I love the description of the transformation of Switzerland, post-war Switzerland, and how they were able to hold on to some of the fervor from 1914 and keep national pride rising. For Dick Diver here, interesting, his name is written out in full, Dr. Richard Diver. That's not how he was introduced at the beginning of Book 1. At the beginning of Book 1, the first mention of Dick Diver, I'm rushing to find it right now, was on page 4? Page 5. Not even until page 5, and he's referred to as Dick. So here you see the essence of the flashback, right? Reintroducing, or introducing for the first time, it would seem, Dick Diver's entrance into the professional world. He is part of the military, and yet it is deemed that he is too valuable a psychiatrist to be involved in the war. They want to keep him safe because he has too many important things to do in the world of medicine, too much to do in the world of psychiatric medicine or psychiatric science. There's too much that he has to offer. He is seen as that much of a brilliant man. And he knows it. This is what we call Dick's heroic period. Dick starts the novel, Book 1, as a god on the beach, a social paragon. How is he different as a younger man? We see him with substance here, perhaps, as a master in his field, a man desired for his knowledge and expertise, real knowledge. What does he know in Book 1? How to get the bellboy to bring him a Mai Tai? I mean, the guy's a goofball if you really look at him closely. What does he know in Book 1? How to get into bed with an 18-year-old girl? He's a 28-year-old man or a 30-year-old man? He's a loser. What does he know in Book 1? How to manipulate people into thinking that he likes them? He's an idiot. He's a fool from our perspective. At least I think that's how we're supposed to read him. And yet we see him ironically presented to us as a man at the top of his game socially. And people really kind of worship at his feet, thinking that he is something special, when in fact What is he? He inherited a bunch of money. He's got an interesting personality that is attractive and magnetic, perhaps, but in truth, he lacks all substance. He's a shell of a man, emptied in many ways of the strength that he once possessed, the real substance. Back then, in his younger days, he was, quote-unquote, too valuable to serve in the war. Returning to the past, here in Book 2, allows the reader to see Dick's decline into extravagance. In both sections, we see him as a paragon of sorts, right? A guy who's really a master, worthy of or I shouldn't say worthy, one who has won the respect of others. He wins the respect in Book 1 through being able to manipulate people, right? I hope you're reading that like I am. At least in that way, I believe that's the narrator's pushing, right? This man is manipulating others in showing how much he loves them. Oh, yeah, no, this is great, and so forth and so on. Really showing his appreciation, looking at them, using what he learned in psychic studies or psychological studies to manipulate and become this very popular guy. Well, the same thing in Book 2, but he's well known and appreciated because of his investment into a world of psychiatric study, because of his investment into real substantial life, not just flirting with social status. We see him in Book 1 as one who has declined into extravagance. In Book 2, we see him at his freshest moment. Here in Book 2, we see more confirmation of the paternal theme. There is a certain lust for youthfulness and the youthful in Dick, and we see that in him in a young age. He mixes, on page 144 and 145, 154 and 155, we see this paternal figure and the doctor figure kind of come into clash. We see them clashing. Does Fitzgerald, or our narrator, seem to suggest that Nicole is not as mentally sick as others believe she is? Is that what Fitzgerald is doing in this second book? This passage, around 154, let's take a look. You're a nice person. Just keep using your own judgment about yourself. You like me? Of course. Would you... They were strolling along toward the dim end of the horseshoe, 200 yards ahead. If I hadn't been sick, would you... would I have been the sort of girl you might have... Ah, slush, you know what I mean. He was in for it now, possessed by a vast irrationality. She was so near that he felt his breathing change, but again his training came to his aid in a boy's laugh and a trite remark. You're teasing yourself, my dear. Once I knew a man who fell in love with his nurse. The anecdote rambled on, punctuated by their footsteps. Suddenly Nicole interrupted, in succinct Chicagoese. Bull! That's a very vulgar expression. What about it? She flared up. You don't think I've got any common sense? Before I was sick, I didn't have any. But I have now, and if I don't know you're the most attractive man I ever met, you must think I'm still crazy. It's my hard luck, all right. But don't pretend. I don't know. Don't pretend I don't know. I know everything about you and me. Dick was at an additional disadvantage. He remembered the statement of the elder Miss Warren as to the young doctors that could be purchased in the intellectual stockyards of the south side of Chicago, and he hardened for a moment. You're a fetching kid, but I couldn't fall in love. You won't give me a chance. What? The impertinence, the right to invade implied, astounded him. Short of anarchy, he could not think of any chance that Nicole Warren deserved. Give me a chance now. The voice fell low, sank into her breast, and stretched the tight bodice over her heart as she came up close. He felt the young lips, her body sighing in relief against the arm growing stronger to hold her. There were now no more plans than if Dick had arbitrarily made some indissoluble mixture. With atoms joined and inseparable, you could throw it all out, but never again could they fit back into atomic scale. As he held her and tasted her, and as she curved in further and further toward him, with her own lips, new to herself, Drowned and engulfed in love, yet solaced and triumphant, he was thankful to have an existence at all, if only as a reflection in her wet eyes. Interesting comparison between Dick and Nicole here, and Dick in the eyes of those he looks at in book 1. He sees him here. Let me look at that again. He was thankful to have an existence, if only as a reflection in her wet eyes. He finds his existence in her eyes. This is a bit of a transference, right? His existence, his identity is wrapped up in psychiatry or psychology, but here his identity is beginning to transfer over into Nicole. He allows himself to transfer his identity into her eyes. My God, he gasped, you're fun to kiss. So Dick Diver. In some ways, Dick Diver we could see as one who sells his soul for the inheritance. What is the old Cain and Abel? No. Jacob and Esau. He sells his birthright for a pot of stew, right? Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for a pot of stew, an old biblical story, and one that's often related to or referred to in literature. Is this what Dick Diver does? Does he sell his birthright? Does he sell his very soul for the inheritance and the ease of life that Nicole's wealth offers? I wrote here, does Fitzgerald seem to suggest that Nicole is not as mentally sick as others believe she is? She, in many ways, is very intuitive here. She gets beyond the bull, she says, right? Bull, I know what's going on. I know exactly what's going on between you and me. She feels it. She knows it. She senses his attraction to her and hers to him. And she wants to throw it on the table and go for it. She wants to embrace the moment. Carpe diem, right? She wants to embrace the moment. This is the 1920s. This is all about extravagance. Embrace what you feel. If you have a desire, go after it. It's yours for the taking. Who's holding you back? The passage here seems to suggest some foreboding. Why? I might say the nature of Dick and Nicole's relationship begins under a false understanding. The relationship is based on healthy versus sick, or based on a doctor-patient relationship. And there seems to be, in some ways, alluded to an unhealthy foundation. So a relationship that begins in a mental hospital. If that doesn't scream unhealth, I don't know what would. A relationship that begins with him saying, my God, you're fun to kiss. This definitely has overtones of a certain sense of lust, a certain desire to throw caution to the wind, to just embrace the extravagant emotion, embrace the desire. And there's definitely some foreboding in that. Other corrosive forces at work in the text that I think are fascinating. And you know, I've always described, or often I'll describe this text, I use the term the whirlpool. I think that's a good one, actually, to see this winding whirlpool dragging Dick down and down and down, and this text really is, I think, focused on his journey downward, this downward spiral that he's drawn into this. Let me do it this way. He's drawn into this tightening spiral. It gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And what's at the center? Is Dick's desire, his desires, his lust, his appetite. That's probably the word I'm looking for there. His appetite is at the very center. His appetite is the driving force, is the gravitational pull on this winding circle inward, looking, if we're at the bottom of the ocean, looking up at a whirlpool, looking at this driving middle point. What is it? At the very bottom, the very pull, is his appetite. It's drawing in. His appetite, perhaps symbolic of the age, the appetite of the age. Dick Diver, the symbol for the 1920s appetite, and an appetite for extravagance, desire for more, and just desire for all the appetites being satisfied, all at once, perhaps. On page 170, we see an interesting conversation and some interesting descriptions. Through the melody flowed a sudden realization that Nicole, hearing it, would guess quickly at a nostalgia for the past fortnight. He broke off with a casual chord and left the piano. It was hard to know where to go. He glanced about the house that Nicole had made. Interesting. That Nicole's grandfather had paid for. He owned only his workhouse and the ground on which it stood. Out of $3,000 a year, and what dribbled in from his publications, he paid for his clothes and personal expense, for cellar charges, and for Lanier's education, that's their son. So far confined to a nurse's wage. Never had a move been contemplated without Dick's figuring his share. Living rather ascetically, traveling third class when he was alone, with the cheapest wine and good care of his clothes, and penalizing himself for any extravagances, he maintained a qualified financial independence. After a certain point, though, it was difficult. Again and again, it was necessary to decide together as to the uses to which Nicole's money should be put. Naturally, Nicole, wanting to own him, interesting language there, wanting to own him, wanting him to stand still forever, encouraged any slackness on his part, and in multiplying ways he was constantly inundated by a trickling of goods and money. The inception of the idea of the Cliff Villa, which they had elaborated as a fantasy one day, was a typical example of the forces divorcing them from the first simple arrangements in Zurich. Wouldn't it be fun if it had been? And then, won't it be fun when? I love this section. I think this is incredible. Okay, so we're book two. We're book two here. And this is the beginning of their marriage. This is the beginning of Dick's life with Nicole. So we're on the outer sphere, the outer line of this whirlpool, if you will. And still here there is some tension, some pull. He wants to keep his money separate. He lives on his own earnings for the most part, right? When he's by himself, he travels third class. He tries to live an ascetic lifestyle, a simpler lifestyle, right? He tries to keep himself out, and yet what has he done? He has that's a tough one, dove? Wow, I should know that. But anyway, he jumps into the water. He jumps into the water, and unbeknownst to him, it's an impossible current drawing him inward. And what is Nicole? Nicole is feeding the desire, right? It's not Nicole as a villain. I don't see Nicole as a villain in this text. But Nicole is definitely feeding a desire that's in Dick Diver. It was not so much fun, he says. His work became confused with Nicole's problems. In addition, her income had increased so fast of late that it seemed to belittle his work. This is the corrosion of the money in Dick Diver's life. This is the corrosion of Dick Diver's own soul, if you will. His desire to live a life, a meaningful life, is being corroded by what? Well, first of all, by what Nicole offers. Again, I don't see Nicole as an antagonistic force. She is part of what allows him to become corroded and degraded in many ways. But she doesn't do that on purpose. She wants to be with this guy. She loves him, perhaps. But in truth, it's Dick Diver's own appetite that is being fueled by the money, right? And then, in addition, as he looks over at Nicole's wealth, just climbing, and her inheritance is so huge, and the interest that they're making probably on that, the more money you have, the more interest you get, and so the compounding interest is just ridiculous, and the millions or whatever it is, thousands and thousands of dollars she's bringing in for doing nothing, and he's trying to squeeze out, $3,000 a year, is brutal, and so he sees his own work being belittled, and he allows here. That's the key. He allows himself to be belittled. He allows himself to be overshadowed. He allows himself to be sucked into this vortex. He dives in and allows himself to be pulled down into this spiral. And we see in book one, he's not fighting it anymore, is he? He's looking around and saying, what else can I get around here? Hey, there's a young girl. I'll have a bite of that. There's a sense. He wants to just eat up. He wants to consume everything. It's crude, but that is what Dick Diver has turned into. Further kind of building on this idea before we move on from there. On 186, I think there's a really interesting comment. Leaving her room, he sent the nurse in to her. There were other patients to see. An American girl of 15 who had been brought up on the basis that childhood was intended to be all fun. His visit was provoked by the fact that she had just hacked off all her hair with nail scissors. There was nothing much to be done for her, a family history of neurosis and nothing stable in her past to build on. The father, normal and conscientious himself, had tried to protect a nervous brood from life's troubles and had succeeded merely in preventing them from developing powers of adjustment to life's inevitable surprises. There was little that Dick could say. Helen, when you're in doubt, you must ask a nurse. You must learn to take advice. Promise me you will. What was a promise with the head sick? He looked in upon a frail exile from the Caucasus, buckled securely in a sort of hammock, which in turn was submerged in a warm medical bath, and upon the 3 daughters of a Portuguese general who slid almost imperceptibly toward paresis. He went into the room next to them and told a collapsed psychiatrist that he was better, always better. And the man tried to read his face for conviction, since he hung on the real world only through such reassurance as he could find in the resonance, or lack of it, in Dr. Diver's voice. After that, Dick discharged a shiftless orderly, and by then it was the lunch hour. So this is Dick, a picture of him working, and him as in this dual role of both husband and doctor to Nicole, but a serious doctor nonetheless, working serious hours and still really driving at his career. We see Dick, again, in the pictures of these patients even. He's trying to convince Helen, when you're in doubt, you must ask a nurse, ask an authority figure. Who are the authority figures in Dick Diver's life? Where is Dick Diver finding his authoritative voices? What is it that's driving him? Well, as we see from book 1, we already know. His appetite drives him. We see him asking for no advice. We see him seeking out no authority. We see him looking not anywhere beyond his own appetite. What is my craving? That's what I need. And that is what he dissolves into. There's so much to look at in this text, but let me see here. There's a turning point for Dick Diver when his father dies. In a way, it seems the end of his former self and life, as the narrator comments. And perhaps this is one of the key steps of Dick Diver, or perhaps if we're looking at using the swirl, kind of the whirlpool. I see it as steps, and yet in some ways he jumps into the swirling water and is sucked in, right? So perhaps this is one more way. If we see Dick on the outside of this whirlpool, for the most part here in the beginning of book 2, he's pushing out. He's trying to fight the current. And so, as he fights the current, he stays on the perimeter. But here, little by little, he kind of releases some control. He releases some. He gives in, and so he's drawn inward a little bit as we go. And so that's kind of how I see that image working in this text. On 204, it says, "For an hour, tied up with his profound reaction to his father's death, the magnificent facade of the homeland, the harbor of New York, seemed all sad and glorious to Dick, but once ashore the feeling vanished, nor did he find it again in the streets or the hotels or the trains that bore him first to Buffalo and then south to Virginia with his father's body. Only as the local train shambled into the low-forested clayland of Westmoreland County did he feel once more identified with his surroundings. At the station he saw a star he knew, and a cold moon bright over Chesapeake Bay. He heard the rasping wheels of buckboards turning, the lovely fatuous voices, the sound of sluggish primeval rivers flowing softly under soft Indian names. Next day at the churchyard, his father was laid among the 100 divers, Dorseys, and hunters. It was very friendly leaving him there with all his relations around him. Flowers were scattered on the brown, unsettled earth. Dick had no more ties here now, and did not believe he would come back. He knelt on the hard soil. These dead, he knew them all. Their weather-beaten faces with blue flashing eyes, the spare, violent bodies, the souls made of new earth in the forest-heavy darkness of the 17th century. Goodbye, my father. Goodbye, all my fathers. So what's going on here? Why is the death of Dick's father? Why could this be considered a turning point for Dick? A turning point, a letting go, perhaps, right, of the struggle against the whirlpool that's being dragged into. Why could this be seen as a letting go? Well, perhaps it is this former life. Perhaps, as he says, goodbye, my father, goodbye, all my fathers. Perhaps it is the generational pull, it is the generational force, it is generational expectation that he pushed beyond just his own cravings, that he lived beyond just his mere appetites, that he drive for something of significance. And it's perhaps his father and his father's father that drove him originally to reach a great height in the world of psychology. As a psychiatrist, perhaps it is their voices, it is their accountability, generational accountability, that drove him forward. Now, an interesting thing about this is we have, in a way, perhaps a connection with culture here. At the end of the war, we have the 1920s, right? At the end of the war, we have the Roaring '20s, the outbreak of this great extravagance. Could it be a death of fathers has cut loose this generation? The fathers that have died in the war, those who did not return, caused perhaps a breach, a break, and a loss of generational accountability for this next generation of young men and women who are left wild and loose, cut loose from generational expectations, from generational accountability. That can be seen in this way as a positive thing, as a thing that would drive people toward significance and away from a life merely lived for one's appetite. I think that's worth some consideration. So Dick ends up having sex with Rosemary. This is, I think, another turn inward on page 213. It's kind of a strange scene. Dick and Rosemary had luncheon at the Castelli de Cesari, a splendid restaurant in a high terraced villa overlooking the ruined forum of an undermined period of the decadence. Rosemary took a cocktail and a little wine, and Dick took enough so that his feeling of dissatisfaction left him. There's that haunting voice, right? This haunting voice of dissatisfaction that I believe, points back to his father's father, him being cut off from that which was driving him forward, perhaps being cut off from that which is truly substantial and meaningful in life. Afterward, they drove back to the hotel, all flushed and happy, in a sort of exalted quiet. She wanted to be taken, and she was. And what had begun with a childish infatuation on a beach was accomplished at last. So another step toward this extravagance, another step toward his consuming or his gratifying of a desire, and this being, again, driving inward, away from that which what matters, into himself, into a very narrow existence, a narrow sense of existence. You know, I like to connect this, actually. If you look up Dante's Inferno under images in Google, you'll see an interesting diagram that looks a lot like this whirlpool. That's where I began to think about this. I was reading Dante's Inferno alongside this for a class a while back, and I began to kind of think about these things in conjunction. Dante's Inferno is imaged as a narrowing cone, if you will, or like a whirlpool, if you took it, or a tornado, right? But I like the whirlpool idea because there's a gravitational pull, so it seems. And so this Dante's Inferno is that similar shape. And many artistic renderings through the years have shown that. So take a look at that if you want online. It'd be an interesting thing to look forward. But other connections with Dante's Inferno, as Dante's Inferno moves down toward the base, as it gets down low toward the bottom, these are the true damned. These are the real sinners. These are the people who are truly have done some really bad things. Hey, look at that. Hey, buddy. That's my wife, Erica, and my little boy, Sheffield.
Hello.
Can you wave? Hello. Hi, boy. Oh, he wants to be on the camera. Okay, come on. Let's have you on the camera. Oh, I have not taught any classes with my shirt off, which I won't ever do, but he can have his shirt off. He's got a pretty good little physique here, so pretty cool. All right, buddy. This doesn't look interesting to him, I don't think. Okay, let's go back to Mommy then. All right. I can't think of a way to connect Sheffield to Tender as the Night. Oh, there he is. Look. Hey! Okay. You got something to say about Fitzgerald? No? All right. See you later. So connecting with Dante's Inferno. So the people at the very bottom of the cone in Dante's Inferno are those who have done the worst things. And so as Dick Diver moves down in this downward spiral, these are the things that are most damnable that he gets himself involved in. I think an interesting connection. Could Fitzgerald have been using this image as he created Dick Diver's spiral downward? I think it could be possible. We have Baby Warren, who's introduced into this text later on page 215. There is a certain villainous quality to Baby Warren. She is much more calloused and calculating than Nicole has ever seemed. She seems more calloused and calculating even than Dick Diver. She seems to almost one-up him. There is a certain cold contempt, an arrogance, and a power with her. And her wealth also plays a key role in Dick Diver's demise. Again, not as one who causes him to fall, but as one who offers him, door slammed, as one who offers him the ability to throw all his chips on the table, to gamble his life away. She is one who gives him, as a temptress, the ability to throw his life away. As we watch Dick Diver spiral downward, that's always my main kind of thrust as this text goes on. As I read this text, I see an interesting decline in him, and it's multifaceted, right? There's many things. Not only is it sex with Rosemary that is his key decline, but there's other things involved, right? His relationship with money and his relationship with alcohol and substance abuse. There's a lot of things that are part of his extravagant decline. Another kind of side note, though, and I see it as part of this as well, is Nicole's seeming liberation. What is Nicole's journey in this text? What is Nicole's journey? On 275, I think an interesting passage speaks to this. Next morning, Dick came early into Nicole's room. I waited till I heard you up. Needless to say, I feel badly about the evening, but how about no post-mortems? I'm agreed, she answered coolly, carrying her face to the mirror. Tommy drove us home, or did I dream it? You know he did. Seems probable, he admitted, since I just heard him coughing. I think I'll call on him. She was glad when he left her, for almost the first time in her life. His awful faculty of being right seemed to have deserted him at last. Nicole's liberation. Let's go on. That's an interesting passage there because she is finally seeing him in a different way, right? She sees him as one who has declined. She sees him as one who has gone from health to sickness. And in some ways, he sees her as one who has risen from sickness and to health. And perhaps that is one more way in which he releases control. He sees himself as one who has given himself. Perhaps he sees himself as one who has been consumed, as well as one who is consuming. But in some ways, Nicole and Baby Warren have consumed him. Is that the case? I think this book can be read in a very interesting way that would involve the rising of a matriarchy, the replacing of a patriarchy where it's male-dominant, and the replacement of it with a matriarchy, a female-dominant society. Nicole is the woman who was content to live in a man's world, but was she really? Or was she all along subverting, destroying, corrupting? She and Baby Warren, and perhaps the other woman in the text, from the inside out, consuming and destroying. Nicole sees herself as capable. There's a new confidence that seizes her. Nicole went on through her garden routine. She left the flowers she cut in designated spots to be brought to the house later by the gardener. Reaching the sea wall, she fell into a communicative mood and no one to communicate with. So she stopped and deliberated. She was somewhat shocked at the idea of being interested in another man. But other women have lovers. Why not me? In the fine spring morning, the inhabitants of the male world disappeared, and she reasoned as gaily as a flower, while the wind blew her hair until her head moved with it. Other women have had lovers. The same forces that last night had made her yield up to Dick to the point of death now kept her head nodding to the wind, content and happy with the logic of, why shouldn't I? That's great. Again, this could be seen as Nicole's rise, but in the same way that Dick has been driven downward through the gratification of all of his appetites, we could see here this being Nicole's beginning. She has risen from sickness into health, and perhaps here, with this statement, why shouldn't I? This was the logic she was now going to live by, and that is the same logic that we see Dick Divers start with at the beginning of this text, right? Well, at the beginning of his life, or the beginning of his career with Nicole, the beginning of his life with Nicole in book 2, right? It is, why shouldn't I, that draws Dick down this spiral. Nicole, in a very fascinating way, we see perhaps the repetition of this. If there was a Tender is the Night book 2, or Tender is the, no, there is a book 2. If there is a Tender is the Night second book, perhaps it would begin here with Nicole saying, why shouldn't I? And thus the beginning of her decline. Because what is the end? What is the result of this type of logic? According to the text, it is a decline into the abyss and self-destruction. She is prepared to leave her doctor, as it says. There is a liberation with Nicole. On page 300, approaching noiselessly, she saw him behind his cottage, sitting in a steamer chair by the cliff wall, and for a moment she regarded him silently. He was thinking. He was living a world completely his own. And in the small motions of his face, the brow raised or lowered, the eyes narrowed or widened, the lips set and reset, the play of his hands, she saw him progress from phase to phase of his own story, spinning out inside him, his own, not hers. Once he clenched his fists and leaned forward. Once it brought into his face an expression of torment and despair. When this passed, its stamp lingered in his eyes. For almost the first time in her life, she was sorry for him. It is hard for those who have once been mentally afflicted to be sorry for those who are well. And though Nicole often paid lip service to the fact that he had led her back to the world she had forfeited, she had thought of him really as an inexhaustible energy, incapable of fatigue. She forgot the troubles she caused him at the moment when she forgot the troubles of her own that had prompted her, that he no longer controlled her. Did he know that? Had he willed it all? She felt as sorry for him as she had sometimes felt for Abe North and his ignoble destiny, sorry as for the helplessness of infants and the old. Now that's interesting, especially if we want to read this as Nicole's coming of age. We can see this as Dick's decline, and we can see this as Nicole's coming of age, a very interesting kind of contrasting plot line, right? If this is Nicole's coming of age, this is her coming into health, coming to see the world as it is, and now that she's of age, what will she do? And as I just mentioned before, most likely, why shouldn't I will lead her on a similar decline as Dick, and that will become the plot line of her life as well. So Nicole remarries, right? 310. Tommy Barvin becomes her choice. And I think this is a fascinating one. A fascinating turning point at the end of the text. Tommy faced Dick, 310, saying, I think Nicole wants a divorce. I suppose you'll make no obstacles? A troop of 50 more swarmed after the first bicycle racers, strung out over 200 yards. A few were smiling and self-conscious, a few obviously exhausted, most of them indifferent and weary. A retinue of small boys passed, a few defiant stragglers. A light truck carried the dupes of accident and defeat. They were back at the table. Nicole wanted Dick to take the initiative, but he seemed content to sit with his face half-shaved, matching her hair half-washed. So a turning point. What's fascinating here, I think, is something about Nicole's life. She reflects on her health and rejuvenation, right? Her marriage to Tommy Barbin, not the picture of health, right? An interesting choice, right? A mercenary. Now, why did she go after a mercenary? Because perhaps it is Nicole's quest. Nicole sees in others an opportunity to gain by them. She perhaps can be seen as one like a leech who attaches herself and then sucks the vitality out of those that she connects herself to. This could be one way of reading Nicole. And whenever I read this part about Tommy Barbin, it's hard for me not to see Nicole as being one of those who is seeking someone who can take her to the next level, seeking someone who can help her get what she wants. Nicole, in a similar way to Dick Diver, is consuming, and is always consuming, always satisfying a desire, always satisfying a craving. She sees Dick, as it says here, on the top of 311. So it had happened. And with a minimum of drama, Nicole felt outguessed, realizing that from the episode of the camphor rub, Dick had anticipated everything. But also, she felt happy and excited, and the odd little wish that she could tell Dick all about it faded quickly. But her eyes followed his figure until it became a dot, and mingled with other dots in the summer crowd. That's a great image, and Fitzgerald masterfully showing this relationship end, right? As Nicole sees Dick fade into a dot, this man who was once a giant to her, to be looked at by Dick was all the world to everyone else, right? And here he is fading out into a mere speck. This kind of builds into my whirlpool idea, right? Dick coming all the way down to what? To a single point, to a single dot. I know that's not the physics of a whirlpool, but nonetheless, the image of it ends at a point, and that is where Nicole sees Dick. She sees him all the way through to his decline. And so, our final fall or rise we see played out on page 314. Nicole kept in touch with Dick after her new marriage. There were letters on business matters and about the children. When she said, as often as she did, "I loved Dick, and I'll never forget him," Tommy answered, "Of course not. Why should you?" Dick opened an office in Buffalo, but evidently without success. Nicole did not find what the trouble was, but she heard a few months later that he was in a little town named Batavia, New York, practicing general medicine, and later that he was in Lockport doing the same thing. By accident, she heard more about his life there than anywhere. That he bicycled a lot, was much admired by the ladies, and always had a big stack of papers on his desk that were known to be an important treatise on some medical subject, almost in process of completion. He was considered to have fine manners, and once made a good speech at a public health meeting on the subject of drugs. But he became entangled with a girl who worked in a grocery store, and he was also involved in a lawsuit about some medical question. So he left Lockport. And here we have Dick Diver at his decline. Another image of him with another woman doing other things in terms of satisfying his appetite and perhaps building a treatise on some important medical thing, but having that dissolve with a lawsuit, with his own infatuation with another woman, always on the move to satisfy his inner cravings, all the way down to that final point. And we don't know much about Nicole's ending. Obviously, it just ends there. We can, I suppose, now I would assume, as I've already mentioned, I would assume that her journey downward would take the same shape in many ways, and perhaps that's what we've seen her do too, as she has taken hold of Dick and drawn him into her own appetite and into her own consumption. As she now takes hold of Tommy Barvin, a man strong, a mercenary, kind of militant military man, a mercenary, if you will, a hired hand, a hired military man. Perhaps he's the next picture of strength that she wants to conquer, and as she consumes him, draws him down. And it may be perhaps that her whirlpool is much deeper even than Dick's, because she is able to fund her own addictions. She's able to fund her own consumptive desires. And so with that, we end the Fitzgerald lecture. Hope you enjoyed the text. Oh, one final cameo by the little guy. Say bye-bye.